Hey guys, today we are going to see about what is constructor and what are the rules involved in building the constructor and how the default constructor works and why do we need constructor. And also we are going to discuss about what is methods and how to declare the methods and what are the difference between the predefined method and the user defined method and why do we need to use methods. So before wasting time, let's go into the video. What do you mean by constructor? So a constructor is a special function that is going to initialize your values. What are the values? That is the instance variables value. How can we understand by the term constructor in a layman terms? So let us assume that a constructor is going to construct a building, right? So that constructor is the object. So when he enters to that building, he will get all his safety equipments like the helmets, the jacket and the shoe. So these are all the values and the person is the object. So whenever he goes to the building, he will automatically get all those safety equipments. So the constructor does this. So the constructor will automatically provide all the necessary values. So now we understood what is the constructor. So now we are going to discuss about what are the rules involved in the constructor. So the first rule is the constructor should be the same name as the class name and the constructor should be public by default and no other explicit written type must be given to that. So what are the different types of constructor? So there are two types of constructor we generally use. One is default constructor and then the parameterized constructor. So the default constructor is the one which we will use after the new keyword. So this student is the constructor and if we didn't pass any arguments, then it is called default constructor. And if we pass an argument inside a constructor, then it is called as parameterized constructor. Here I have created a class called school and inside that school I have a 4 instance variables which is name, roll number, marks and the present or absent which is a boolean value. And inside my main class I have created an object called Ashok which I have initialized by using a constructor. So here you can see after the new keyword I have used a constructor called school which doesn't consist of any parameters. So now using this object I'm calling that instance variable and I'm storing that value, right? So there are 4 instance variables that I have discussed previously and I have stored those values inside that object. So after printing that I will get all those details which is present inside that object's instance variable. So now you may have a doubt that after this new keyword I have called a constructor, right? But inside my class called school, here I haven't created a constructor called school, right? So how does it work? And does Java creates the school constructor automatically? So how does default constructor works in Java? So you have created a class called student and inside this student you haven't created a constructor, right? And in your object creation you have called that constructor called student, right? So now when this class file compiles, Java compiler will add a default constructor to your class so that whenever you instantiate your object, this default constructor will be called. So now I have created a parameterized constructor. So this parameterized constructor takes 4 variables as an argument and this argument is getting initialized with your instance variable. So whenever you create an object, you will pass that 4 variables inside this arguments and that will automatically get initialized to your instance variable. So this makes your initialization easy. So in order to initialize your instance variable inside this class, you can just add the values inside your constructor and this constructor will automatically initializes your value inside your instance variables. Now I have created an object which calls the parameterized constructor. So you can see the difference here. I have created an object which calls a default constructor. So whenever it calls a default constructor, I need to initialize the values by using this object name dot that instance variable, and I have to initialize it manually inside this main method. But you can see the difference here. So whenever I use the parameterized constructor, I can just pass this value inside this constructor so that my constructor will do the initialization part, and then you can display the values using your print statement. So let's see the output, which will be same as your default constructor. As you can see here, this constructor is called which is the default constructor, and then the details of that particular person has been displayed, and also when it calls the parameterized constructor, that person's detail is also displayed. So thus you can see the difference between the default constructor and the parameterized constructor. So now we are going to discuss about what is methods and why do we need these methods. So methods makes your code more readable. Readable in sense, so let's assume that you're going to add two numbers. So for example, I will give value, two variables. Inside that two variables, I will give two values, which is I will tell the compiler to do 10 plus 20. Okay, and now I will change that value to 15 plus 20. So without this method, you have to do the addition two times, that is a plus b, and again you will initialize that value using like c comma d, and again you will do that c plus d. So you're using 4 lines, but if you are using methods, it can be reduced more. There are two different types of methods that we generally use in any programming language. One is predefined method and another one is the user defined method. So the predefined methods are the methods that has been already defined by the Java developers. So whenever you call this function, you have to be sure that that function should be present inside a class. So here the function name max has been called. So if you misspell this function, you might get an error that this method name is not found. So you have to be sure, because this method has been already defined by the Java developers. Whereas in user defined functions, you are going to define your own function. So in this case, just leave this public static as it will be discussed later. So here the void is the return type, and the find even odd is the function name, and inside this open close parenthesis you can have a number of arguments, and you can add many arguments as you can. So here, so whenever I pass an argument, so for example find even or odd, if I pass a number 9, so this will be called, this function will be called, and this function will perform this operation, and it will give you the result as you're printing that statement. And if the condition is true, then this statement will be printed, or else this statement will be printed. So this is the user defined function. As if you misspell this function, no issues. Here you will get an error that you need to change your function name. So you can change that function name and you can just call those functions. So user defined functions, you can manually change those method name, but in predefined method you can't change this method name as it is defined. So here I have created a custom method which is called add, and inside this add function I have passed two parameters. So these parameters will be passed inside this and it will be calculated. So here this one is the function call to which the function will be called. So here the arguments will be changed whenever the user changes his requirements. So here this thing makes your code more readable, right? So you're calling this add function and it will be going to this function, and it will take a as this first parameter and b as the second parameter, and just it adds the value. This is what the user defined function works. Calling this function, performing the operation, and that's it. So now if I want to return a function, what I can do is, instead of using void, I can give it as a return type, which is, for example, I will give it as integer. So here, if I pass it as an integer, I will get an error. What it says? Missing return statement. So you have to add the return statement. So what I will do is, instead of printing that value, I will return that value as a. So after returning that value, if I try to print that value, the value won't be displayed, because whenever you call this function will be executed and it will be returned to the function which has been called. So now this is the value which will be returned. So this entire function call will be replaced as this value. So how to get that value? Just by printing it or storing it inside a variable, and then you can print it out. So here I will just print this function in order to show you the output. So if I try to run this, I will get the output as 7. Now we are going to see about how to use the predefined function. So what I will do is, I will use the math class. Inside that math class, there is a method which is a static method. So that method can be used. So for example, I will use a math class. Inside that math, I have a lot of methods. I will use the max method because these methods are predefined inside that class called math. So now if I call this function, I need to pass 2 parameters. So I will pass it as 10, 20. So this will return the output as a double value, and that value can be printed out by using the print statement. So if I try to run this, I will get the maximum value. So if I try to give some alternative function name, I will get an error because this function has not been defined inside this class. So you can't create a custom function. You are using the predefined function. So you have to give the exact function name. So how the memory gets allocated? So there are 2 different things. That is the 2 different data structures that will be used in order to store the object or in order to call a function. So here there is a stack memory and then the heap memory. So stack memory will be storing it in a LIFO order, which is last in first out, and in the heap memory it will be like a empty space, and in that empty space you can fill the values as much as you can. So whenever I initialize a value which is num1, which is the 10, so which will be directly assigned inside the stack itself. But whenever I create an object, that is the student Ashok is equal to the new student, this value will be in a form of hexadecimal value. In this case, for simplification, I am given as 101. So this 101 is the address. So this address will be referencing inside the heap memory. So inside this heap memory, I will have all those details. That is the instance variable and the methods that has been defined inside that class. So for each and every object, the structure will be the same, but the values will be the different, and also the address will be the different.